You mentioned the sheer number of nonprofits. And one of the criticisms you hear about nonprofit sector, especially during tough times when there's not enough money to go around, considering that many of these nonprofits are sort of appealing to the same funders, whether they're foundations or donors or others, even those who are providing services, is that unlike marketplaces, private sector marketplaces, theoretically, that nonprofit sector marketplaces or nonprofit sectors don't have the same discipline in terms of mergers, in terms of efficiency of organizations. That too many of them are too small, too many of them are not efficient enough in terms of delivery services, and that sometimes we just have too many of these organizations in similar sectors overlapping each other, redundancy in services, or perhaps just not necessary at all. And so one of the questions that is often raised is, do we have too many nonprofits, and to what effect?
Yeah, well, it's a common question. For those of you who saw some of the data here, it came from a report by the Boston Foundation called Passion and Purpose, which you might want to look at, which was really motivated by this question of too many nonprofits. And I must say, among nonprofits that I work with, there isn't a consensus around that question. My own founder, if you will, Bill Walsack from Cogman Square, who you may have met occasionally, believes that there may be too many nonprofits, although he was somewhat negative about the question when it was first raised. My answer is somewhat different, and this is really just a personal answer. You don't ask, as I say, pizza joints, whether or not the person down the street, whether they should open a shop there or not, because they have to survive, and if they don't survive in the marketplace, they die. That's also true for nonprofits. And if nonprofits are not doing the job, they will not succeed. They simply will not succeed. No one will give them money. Remember, no, they don't survive on tax dollars. They can't tax. If somebody gives them money, it's because it's a voluntary contribution, and they have to, quote, market, I love the word, market their services. They have to convince people that they're doing good work. And if over time they're unable to do that, they don't exist any longer. The other comment I want to make is that generally you don't hear that there are too many nonprofits from nonprofits. You generally hear it from people who donate to nonprofits. And they don't want to have to make the decision about which ones are good and which ones aren't. They want fewer decisions to make. What's interesting is that the growth among foundations has actually exceeded the growth among nonprofits on a percentage basis. There are a lot more family foundations who want their name on the fund than there are nonprofits as a percentage of growth. So why are there so many new funding sources that are smaller that make nonprofits work even harder to get funded? That question has not been answered yet among the philanthropy community. So I feel like if you ask that question, you then have to ask another question is, how are you going to get fewer? Right now there is a fund that's been created by the Boston Foundation that allows people to access funding to merge or to share back office services. I think that's a terrific solution to a problem that they themselves feel that they've identified. There are some savings, there are some efficiencies with nonprofits. I also want to point out one other thing. They showed in their own study that as nonprofits get larger and larger, they don't necessarily get more efficient because they increase the number of management levels that exist within the organization. That is, people who don't provide direct care services. And the overall admin costs as a percentage of budget don't actually go down beyond a certain point of growth. So it may be an important point to raise when you ask whether more efficient. Last point, a gentleman asked me, how do I help the guy who just got out of MCI, Concord, get his life back? I want to be able to, I've been visiting the folks there, I want to be able to help them make the transitions and not go back. And I said to him, well, there are Self and Sex Opportunity Council, many nonprofits who have reentry programs. You might want to work with and for one of them. And he said, yeah, maybe, but I just don't feel that they have the approach to working with these people that I think actually works. And my answer to that person is, you've got to make that decision whether you want to put the time and effort into building an organization or whether you want to put the time into working with people. That's your decision to make. But the last thing I want to do is undercut the passion and commitment that that individual has, that can't possibly be generated by a funding source or by a nonprofit structure. Let's be careful that we don't undercut the passion that people have to do the kind of work that nonprofits are doing.
Just wanted to give you an aside, Dave. We started a pilot reentry program because we have so much crime in North Dorchester. We just did this to get under the crime, the root of it, people coming out of jail and getting back to their gang in 24 hours. So they asked us, since we have all this housing, what if we tried a pilot reentry with the House of Corrections, Nation of Islam, a few other groups. We now have 111 guys in it. I think there's a couple of women that are more on the side. It's mostly men. 74 are working and 9 live in our housing.
Oh, a pilot.
Okay? And then we'd like to have all the CDCs do this in each neighborhood. So if you don't have to create a group home and get all big NIMBY fight over this whole thing, you just tuck them away, give them the services, get them a job, and they'll be just fine, thank you. As long as the supports are there, you know. I think it's true. It really does work. And people who are passionate, have them call me. We have plenty of work for him to help us with. I mean, it's been a blessing for me to learn what this is and how it works and how these people's lives change.
I just want to add that the answer to your question, Chris, is really, unlike government, nonprofits have to live in the marketplace.
Yep.
And so they have their own discipline. They also happen to have their own board of directors, they have the IRS, and they have other sources of accountability that the for-profit sector doesn't have.
We also pay taxes for all our properties.
Well, that's it.
A lot of taxes.
Okay. Question from the audience. Sir.
Hi.
Who are you? State your name and.
Alex Talcott. I'm interested in the role of the individual middle-class donor. Bruce Bartlett had an article last week suggesting that boomers owe a debt to society and should bequest money directly to the government. Do you have a position on whether they should bequest that money directly to the government versus nonprofits? Or are you generally not in the business of telling an individual middle-class person what they should do? Charity is up to the well-off, and maybe a person who makes $50,000 a year shouldn't feel a moral obligation to tithe or something.
Yeah. I generally tell them to give it to us. But when that doesn't work, I generally leave it to the individual. I would not prescribe in any way that people would, how they should deal with their money. I would say this, that we are now under siege by some of the folks in Congress these days, I won't be too specific, to take away our tax exemption for a variety of contributions because the government wants to be able to believe that it could use that money more efficiently, more effectively. And so we're under attack for our tax exemption. For example, the mayor attempted, and his plan attempted to create something called the payment in lieu of tax system in Boston, which would have Boston nonprofits pay 25% of what they would otherwise pay as for-profit organizations to the city government in lieu, quote unquote, payment in lieu of taxes, but it's a fixed number, a fixed percent. And it's not the only city that's doing that, although Boston happened to have taken the lead on it, and now other cities are looking at it. Boston has actually decided not to go forward with it yet because of some of the conversations we've had with them about the long-term impact. But I don't believe that people should be told what to do. But I do think that the tax exemption is a critical part of the nonprofit world. And the reason why, if they have their IRS certification, it's because they have a mission that does not relate to and can't inure to the benefit of the organization. You can't do it. If you do, you get your IRS exemption pulled from you. So these are mission-driven organizations, They're not profit-based. Nobody makes a profit. No one's allowed to make a profit. And as long as nonprofits meet that criteria, then people should be invited to make those contributions based upon their own values.
I'd like to comment. There is a village market in Rosendale, the story I told about the urban village, that was capitalized by 1,000 shareholders. They were all middle class and working class people. And they created the anchor business that helped turn Rosendale Village around. And all those shareholders are proud of themselves and proud of their neighborhood. And I think most donors, there's the big ones, but I think Dorchester Bay raises about $1.1 million in grants or donations each year. We have an annual gala that brings in about 115,000. And it's mostly small donors. And I think what we also find is they would like to participate in some way. So that, and even rich people say this too, because I used to raise a lot of money from them out in Winchester and places like that for the Boston Community Loan Fund. So people do want to be involved, whether you're a $100 donor or a $20 donor, and low-income people want to be donors too. And I think it makes you feel powerful because you're helping solve problems and make something happen. So I really encourage middle-class donors. I'm just sorry that there aren't more fun activities, but I think if they get to know their favorite nonprofit, or a lot of them sure give money to their church, but I think in the end they wind up being very excited about participating.
The back.
Hi, my name is Paula Robinson Deere, and I have a question.
Is that Paul's wife?
Yes, it is.
See Paul up there too. Hi, Paul.
This question is for David. Your stats on nonprofits show that nonprofits don't understand image versus don't understand public relations. When you look at image versus the actual work that's been done,
Sure.
they don't really understand public relations, marketing, outreach. And now that we're looking at communications and current economy going global, what do you think that nonprofits are going to have to do to begin to turn this image around? Because the competition for funds is going to become more fierce, and I've learned that corporate and public relationships are built on these kinds of images.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's part of the reason why we were created, actually. We have three missions. One is public policy and advocacy, one is capacity building and member services, and one is public awareness for nonprofits. And we were created because of a recognition that people feel like, look, I work for a nonprofit, I'm mission driven, I care about what I'm doing, I'm a nice person, why wouldn't people like and respect what we do? And it turns out that over time, the image of nonprofits has really gotten a bad rap, and as you say, the NIMBY syndrome has really taken hold. In terms of what they should do, I think probably the most important thing is to recognize that it's a problem, and to recognize that they can't be isolated and sort of do their own thing and think that the world is going to take care of it. It's a different world than it was 20 or 25 years ago in the nonprofit sector, and people really now are beginning to question. And part of the reason is there have been abuses. There have been more and more abuses over time of the nonprofit status, and so people are beginning to look differently at nonprofits. So I guess my first answer is take the problem seriously. And there are a lot of really good training programs for nonprofit leaders. I work with mostly small and medium-sized nonprofits. Mass General has its own public affairs department, and they're a little more powerful than I am. But for the smaller ones, we have training programs to help nonprofits figure out how they can enhance their image in their local community. But more than anything, I think they have to take it seriously. They have to put resources into it. And by the way, it does enhance their ability over time to raise money, whether it be government funds or private funds. That's an investment that does have a return if people take it seriously.
Paul, I just wanted to add also, I think collaboration is the key to improve marketing. And that's why this Fairmont line is bringing new resources that we couldn't get separately, for the both development, for the organizing, both capital and operating money, and for the Greenway. So if people get together and make a, what do they call it at the Kennedy School, a big, hairy, audacious goal, then the money will come and the PR does happen. And it may be hard for your original board to have to share the limelight with your collaboration, but I've seen this with a lot of groups where the marketing really does come with increased collaboration and, what did I say, increased power, right?
Let me follow up with that real quickly, because what we've also seen in the last 20 years is the increase in ways that potential donors can hold nonprofits accountable through transparency kinds of databases. I mean, after those 990 forms that they all file, we can look up now through GuideStar and other sources, and so we can see, and there's also rating services that allow potential donors and others who want to assess performance of nonprofits, what percentage of funds go toward administration, what percentage go toward programs, et cetera. Now, that's important because with the transparency comes accountability. And that's, I think, getting to your question about how nonprofits can maintain their respectability and accountability in the face of often withering criticism. One of that is transparency. So, just an add to that. Next question, then Barry.
My name is Cynthia. It's a little bit on the same question. The circles I travel in, and with the economic situation in Massachusetts, people start discussions about, and it's really probably the transparency and the nonprofit accountability, that seemingly the largest of large institutions, hospitals, universities, churches, and insurance companies, considered to be considered in the status of nonprofit seems rather ridiculous, especially when you read about the former leader in Blue Cross Blue Shield getting quite a substantial golden parachute. I believe that was about a year ago. And so I think in these desperate times, are there any thoughts about having the largest of large not-for-profits, possibly an amendment to change what their contribution could be when we're so desperate to pay, to offset the state deficit?
When you say their contribution, what did you mean by that?
Well, meaning that if the tax contribution.
Oh, that they should pay more taxes?
Absolutely,
they should pay taxes?
yeah.
It's interesting because, I mean, my argument about that is that if you look at the highest paid CFOs or CEOs in hospitals, they make what we would consider to be absolutely outrageous salaries. If you put them in the private sector, they would be paupers. They would be absolute paupers. Because our comparison of the scale of responsibility that they have in the private sector is just not compared. However, having said that, the question for me is their money going toward their mission? If it's not going toward their mission, then the IRS should step in and they should hold them accountable. They have a variety of regulatory means to do that. My concern about it is the challenge that we have in figuring out who does or doesn't fall into that category. There are a lot of gray areas. So if we're talking about, for example, the large hospitals, are we talking about Metro West Medical, or are we talking just about Mass General, or are we talking about the Cogden Square Health Center? At what level do we decide it's too big? Or is there another mechanism for accountability? So I have some real concerns about it. I would rather hold them accountable through the transparency mechanisms that we have and through the light of day, right? Once the world knows what those CEOs are making and what the directors are making, things begin to change. But I'd be very careful about changing state or federal law to require that they pay taxes. Because I think you go down a very slippery slope, and it's really hard to stop that ball from rolling.
Thank you. Jeanne, you want to add to that, or?
No.
Okay. Barry.
Barry Bluestone. We've been having a lot of discussions in this class about what is the appropriate role of state and local government. And by extension, 2 years ago, we had a similar course on policy advice to the next president, just before the Obama election. One of the things that we see more and more, and we hear it in the statistics that Chris mentioned from the Gallup poll, is that a lot of people do not think they get their dollar's worth of service out of the dollars of taxes they pay. Part of the problem that you have with government is it's a monopoly. It's the only one who offers a particular service. Would it make sense, and you can think as broadly as you want, for nonprofits, which actually do compete with each other, but not in a profit-making mode, would it make sense for nonprofits to pick up more and more of what government does in terms of delivering direct services at the local level, at the state level, given the success that many nonprofits have had doing those things?
I think you should answer this first,
I'll
Jeanne,
jump in.
because you've done so much work that could otherwise be done.
Um,
Private sector.
If you think about public housing, the public schools, and welfare, those are three big, monstrous government things, right? Big bureaucracies. So think about what's happening with all those three things. The schools are breaking into smaller schools, and schools inside the school, charter schools, and pilot schools, right? Then you think about public housing. They're doing all these Hope Sixes and breaking them up and turning them more into villages and mixed income, right? With more green space. And then if you think about the welfare system, well, even mental hospitals, and then people are group homes, they're doing independent living. When it comes to the welfare system, they're trying to get people back to work. There's a decentralization of these big central government behemoths. And the CDCs, I think the reason we're successful is we're kind of lean, mean, place-based machines. And so you have to be lean, you have to make it happen, you're absolutely holistic, you're working on these multiple, jobs, housing, crime, reentry, the local crime watches, and so on. The street down, Holmes Ave, nobody would buy the new houses we built, so our Cape Verdean organizers go down there and organize the street, and in 2 months, all 4 houses are sold. Because now the street's organized and has a crime watch. So when I think about the welfare system, the public schools, and the public housing, that they have to break it up a bit because it's just got too big. And I do think there are things we can do as locally accountable nonprofits that just work better. And even now, we get a ton of contracts. Like we're doing foreclosure intervention counseling and remodifying the mortgages. We get money from the city for that. We get money from the city for de-letting loans for people to make their homes safe. There's lots we can do that when the city gets involved, it's just too slow. They don't have enough people, and if they try to do it, it doesn't quite work. We get about $3 million now of state and city federal money to rehab these foreclosed houses. We can buy them for $200, rehab them for $250, sell them instead of for $550. We sell them for about $270. Why? Because we get gap from the city and state. Those are all examples of ways programmatically we can just use government resources without the government running the whole thing. The government doesn't tell us that we are accountable to them when we use their money. But my board, that's who I'm accountable to, and it's a completely community-based board. So I think those are good examples of nonprofits taking on what people used to call government-run stuff. And I think we all understand that bigness isn't always better. Obviously, highways, train tracks, and that kind of thing. You don't want nonprofits doing that stuff. But the public schools, my kids went to Boston Public Schools, and they didn't do so well, I mean, they're both somewhat crippled by Boston Latin School, and neither one finished there. We had a hard time getting them to the Arts Academy and things like that. So, I have feelings about us decentralizing and getting more cozy, even in the schools, in the public schools.
I just want to add one thought. And when people say, I don't get what I paid for out of government, I just want to sort of alert folks to 2 things. One of the reasons for that is that it is a commonwealth. And maybe you shouldn't get what you pay for. Maybe someone else should get what you pay for, because they may need it more than you do. So getting what you pay for isn't the deal we cut with government. It's does government do what it's supposed to be doing, and does it do it well? I was talking to a friend of mine across the street the other day. He's a gentleman of the other party, and he said, these guys look at the way they keep these streets. And I said, you're right. I just decided that we should all hire a dump truck, and we should plow our own street together. And he said, well, we couldn't do that, there's only 6 houses on our street. And I said, oh, I didn't think of that. Maybe we could team up with the people down the street and have there be 10 houses. No, that wouldn't be enough. And I said, maybe we could have the town do it. And he started laughing. The notion is there are some things, and that disabled child is another example. You know, you read about the public schools. Public schools have to take care of that child, and those are probably 5 teachers that school doesn't have because of that one child. Private sector doesn't have to deal with that. So I do want to remind us that government is not only a mechanism for doing things that are necessary, but doing things that are compassionate, for which there's literally no other source. And we ought to keep that in mind when we think about getting our fair share out of government.
I would also want to say, even if you keep the government in there doing public schools, what we learned after 8 years of Bill Edgerly money helping us organize the parents in 3 of the local schools in Upham's Corner is even the public schools work better. I'm a former teacher years ago. That if you get the parents organized and they get involved in the school gets better. The kids do better, the parents are less overwhelmed. So treating the school like a neighborhood school works. So the key is, again, organizing people. The Boston Police. You don't want to have 50 different police departments in your town, but they are better if they work in community policing with this and that crime watch, right? We're the eyes and ears. We work with them, and they can also work with our ex-offenders who come out. So again, it's decentralizing. I'm not just an anarchist. I think it's well-organized people working in kind of local communities can get the best out of the police and can make sure they don't go and just arrest all the kids of color just because they're on the street corner, or when the white kids who do the same thing don't get arrested. But it's also that they know who the high impact players are. And that's the kind of thing that the community working, the nonprofits and the residents working with the police can make that big public thing function better.
Margaret.
Margaret Dyson. There are so many distinctions in this. The difference between enormous nonprofits like Mass General that doesn't pay taxes but still expects the city to put out its fires, quite literally, and the difference between services, privatizing services that are paid for with tax dollars being spent by nonprofits versus charitable dollars. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a real concern that when you start privatizing public services, public responsibilities, as you call them, that you start turning those into things that are perceived as charitable activities rather than responsibilities. Mm-hmm. You do have the possibility of having precisely the same responsibilities, but if that philanthropic money dries up, you have a reduced capacity in government to meet those responsibilities. So you start shifting it into a charitable sector and saying aesthetic improvements of parks can be a charitable activity rather than a public investment. You reduce the capacity of government to meet its own responsibilities by shifting that. And how do you create a balance between those two things, where you're not turning public service into public charity?
Yeah, it's an interesting point about the, Massachusetts endowments lost 23% during the recession. So they stopped funding a lot of these activities. Like I said about taxing power, they don't have taxing power. So you're right. When you put yourselves at much greater risk for funding if you depend, if you go entirely to the nonprofit sector as a vehicle. What is Jeanne, the other responsibility?
Well, I'm thinking about Jane Addams in Chicago and Hull House. Remember back in the days of good old unbridled social Darwinism? Government didn't pay for any of that stuff, and kids are working 12 hours a day, and the unions weren't organized, and people were paid nothing. think about those days. It was really kind of pre-Roosevelt era where it was social Darwinism, that the government wasn't involved in these kind of programs, and I don't know that any of us want to go back there. So, I mean, maybe some of the Tea Party folks want to go back there, but I think the majority of Americans probably don't want to go back there. My hunch is. So what you're raising is about systemic responsibilities, and even good organizing looks at systemic change or systemic fairness. So the whole Fairmount effort, the fighting for the stations, that's a system change, right? Getting X number of police assigned to your neighborhood that doesn't have enough is a system change, right? So, yeah, I'm with you. I think the question is, how do you decide, and how do the kind of political, what do we call that, the forum, the old Greek forum, that's Latin.
Agora.
The what?
The agora.
The agora. People will come and argue about stuff, the old town meetings. So you just really want to have social engagement so that people can try to work that through by their own communities and with their own government. And I don't think it's simple. I think our president even said this just the other day in Madison, Wisconsin. There is no substitute for organizing people, because if other people, James Madison said this in the Federalist Papers, that a republic is a collection of interest groups. If you're not organized, you lose. Those who are organized win. So all of us who care about somebody being better organized than we are, better get organized. And if you feel something belongs in the public sphere and is a systems issue, then you can organize like we did with Fairmount and get your stations, you see? So I think, again, it sounds like, organizing is the answer to everything. I think it probably is.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Alex Weinstein. You were speaking, Jeanne, about the power of collaboration among different nonprofit groups to sort of organize their power. But one of the benefits of this sort of decentralized model of providing what would otherwise be government services is that your organization or CDCs or all these small nonprofits sort of function as little laboratories of services or developing methods for providing those services. And I was wondering sort of what role either the government or sort of a statewide nonprofit like the one you run, David, should or can play in sort of helping to share best practices among those nonprofits and harness their collective power.
Well, I mean, that is a good question. The reason I love organizing on the Fairmount line is it's both big and it's small. Because ultimately, Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. That, the people in Upham's Corner really don't want to go down to Mattapan for a meeting. But they will show up maybe once a year for a big rally to get the $167 million, right? But they're really more interested in making sure, like the Upham's Corner station is not going to shut down during construction. So they'll have 200 people show up for that, and maybe only 10 of those will go down to Mattapan, right? So people really do want to work on their own local communities for the most part. And they have the most energy and it's easier, and they also know people. So I think what Dave's group, we have a mass association of CBCs that's part of the Mass Nonprofit Network. We need them to lobby for us at the State House to make sure the youth jobs money doesn't get cut, or to make sure the small businesses don't get cut, or that we have X dollars in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. We really need them to lobby for those programs. They also provide visibility. And so I'm joking these days with the transit justice and the transit for Massachusetts and the new sustainable communities, this and that our collaborations are collaborating with our collaborations. It's exhausting. I feel like I live with 4 or 5 onions around my head with all these layers of things. So I do think best practices also, groups like Dave's can lift up models, and I think people really do want to hear what's working, because ultimately, some collaborations aren't so hot, and some are just takeovers, and some are forced marriages, and some, it's like we have in our Fairmount program, we have the 2 big community development corps and the 2 smaller ones that are only 10 years old don't have 1,000 units of housing and don't have our balance sheet. So, sharing the gumdrop is a good thing, but you have to be careful, and I'm sure Dave has all the answers figured out of how to collaborate.
Yeah, let me just add one point to what Jeanne was saying about the local nature of that work, why organizing is so essential. If you look at the Chicago schools, they're all local schools, even though they're city schools. Every one of the Chicago schools has a school council that was elected, literally elected, so they get to spend their budget by their local school council, and they don't have to be charter schools. They're run by the parents and the teachers there. So you can have a decentralized model that isn't non-governmental. The government simply has to be a little more creative about it. But what's powerful about what Jeanne is doing is, if you look at the South End, you didn't have poverty alleviation, you had poverty removal. You just relocated poverty in another place. It did absolutely nothing to help poor people. What Jeanne is doing is very different, very different. And it's creating a sense that what you own, that is literally what you own in every sense, from a property standpoint, from a psychological and philosophical standpoint, you invest in.
That's right.
You get so distributing ownership through governmental policy, is probably the most revolutionary thing we can do to ultimately eliminate poverty. The challenge we face is that not all of the problems that exist in local communities have local causes or local solutions. That's the challenge. If you look at the environmental challenges that we face, you can't solve it on a block by block basis. If you look at questions 1, 2, and 3 on the ballot tonight, if these 3 ballot questions pass, all of that list of funding that Jeanne was talking about are all in jeopardy. And there's no one in Codman Square, if they vote 100% to defeat those questions and everybody else votes differently, those monies go down the drain. So there are times and places where you absolutely have to organize, quote unquote, on a grander scale. And that's why I think the collaboration with local organizations and state and federal and national organizations is essential, and why the dialogue is essential in order to keep that balance between state, local, federal, and local organizing. So I feel like, to the extent in which we collectively can see ourselves as citizens of the various communities to which we participate, and we exercise that citizenship concretely, we'll be able to enhance the quality of life for ourselves and the folks that we care about.
I think that's a perfect place to leave this. It is clear whoever is the next governor will confront the situation where I think it's quite clear, as we've seen from last week and this week, that pulling a thread called the budget pulls out many different facets, affects many different dimensions. It's not going to be a simple private, public, nonprofit sector question. It's not going to be a simple size of government question. It's going to be, what do we want government to do, and how will it get done, either by itself, through the nonprofit sector, or through the private sector. I want to thank our guests for a provocative and compelling discussion.